that we once had, but it taught us an awful lot. This has been a remarkable learning time for the church. And in some cases, what we were learning is what did not work, but we were also learning more about why it didn't work. And one of the other things that it taught me during this time is that almost all of the work that you see in this PowerPoint right now was in search of trying to answer institutional questions. We may get back to that a couple of times as we go along here. Most of my time in ministry was as a leader trying to answer institutional questions. How do we serve the institution? How do we make the institution of the church stronger? How do we get resources that will support the institution? And yet there was a whole category of questions about mission and purpose that were not being addressed. And so all I want to say at this point is that this has been remarkably good learning for us. It has been a time of stress. 1965 was the beginning of the decrease of our institutional membership. We never had a net gain of members since that time. And what we're learning is that this was really not an institutional problem. If you look at the literature, you'll find that almost every institution, and especially membership-based institutions, went through exactly this same kind of a period following 1965. Robert Putnam has a book out now called, oh boy, I can't remember what it's called. That's what happens to a man my age. It has something to do with,
Bowling Alone.
No, his latest one, thanks for the offer, but his latest one has to do with going up again. And I'll try to get back to that table. It's actually quite a significant book. But one of the things that he does point out is that if we think that we've been struggling as a United Methodist Church, not only other religious denominations, but every single membership organization and institutions of all kinds have been going through this same thing. And so what we're learning is that the decline that we have been going through is not really a problem. It's a lagging indicator of a much, much deeper cultural change. And so it has more to do with the water we swim in than the way we're swimming. So that's the context. Let me pause real quick at the very beginning here and just ask, are there any immediate questions that you have? Because I'm going to jump in from there and move on to a different part of the conversation. Anything show up so far?
Yes.
What do we got?
We have from Bron Yoakum. Is some of the discouragement among some people a frustration with the organization's inability, unwillingness to change? So is the frustration with the organization's unwillingness and ability to change?
Sure, absolutely. And let me jump into that really quickly at this point. I was going to talk about it in a minute or two anyhow, but let's go into this from two different points. There is one sociologist who really talks about the fact that we are now living in a liquid culture. And what he means by that is that we are in a culture that is changing faster than we can even implement the responses that we're trying to come up with to the change in the culture. So in other words, if you're in a situation that has dramatically changed, you come up with some kind of a strategy that you think is going to make it, help you move along. And before you can even implement the strategy you figured out, the culture has changed again. It's a liquid culture. There's nothing steady or there's nothing stable here. And there have been other times in history when this has been the case. Somewhere around the first to the second decade in the 1900s was very much the same, when changes were coming as fast as that. Ours have an awful lot to do with technology and so forth and globalization. But It's a liquid culture. Okay. In that liquid culture, institutions are always formed as a steady base. They are not changed to be, they are not built to be resilient. They are not built to be adaptive. They are built to be steady. That's one of the things we depend upon in terms of institutions, whether we're talking about the institution of the church, whether we're talking about the institution of education, whether we're talking about the institution of marriage. These are all tried to get formed in ways to stabilize our lives rather than help us change. And so if you extend that a little bit, a congregation, let's just talk about the congregation, not the denominational structure, but the congregation. A congregation is a tradition-based voluntary association. That's the category of the kind of organization it would fit into, a tradition-based voluntary association. It does not, by its very nature, change easily. In fact, it's hard to change. A voluntary association is one in which it's a very easy boundary to get in because it's voluntary. All you have to do in a congregation is show up and you're in. The small congregation, you show up 3 times, you're on the board because, you know, it's easy to get in. It's also really easy to get out. All you have to do is not come and people don't even call you to say what's wrong. Easy in, easy out. And one of the things about voluntary associations is that they want members so that if you bring people in, what you want to do is make them as happy as possible so that they don't go out because it's easy for them to leave again. And so you start to focus in on what do most people want. And you begin to, you kind of focus your, is this making sense so far? And so essentially what happens is that when you focus in on keeping people in, you reduce your adaptability, the capacity that you have to change with the outer culture, because you're not paying attention to what's happening out there. You're paying attention to what people want in here. Tradition-based voluntary associations are hard to change. They pay attention to people's preferences over their purpose. And they routinely ask leaders to change things. We'll get back to this again in a minute. But they never reward leaders for that change. Because a change is an idea that they may want, but it will interrupt the preferences that they currently have. So voluntary associations, tradition-based voluntary associations are very, very difficult to lead. This is, you know, congregations are not just a run-of-the-mill, ordinary kind of a, you know, kind of a small business operation or something. They function very, very differently, and it does lead to the kind of frustration, and it very much undergirds what Bron is, you know, kind of questioning here. And let me take a moment to say hi, Bron, and hi to so many other people whose faces and names I'm recognizing here. It's been such a long time since I've seen you all. So anyway, Kevin, any other question before we jump back in?
Yes, we have a question is, what effect does hostility have in a liquid environment?
All right, good question. Next question. Friends, hostility is not a function of the liquid culture, of the rate of change itself. Hostility, incivility, I think has different origins. And that really comes from the fact that we are now a culture that is focused on the individual. This might make a little bit of sense as we go on here again today. But we are no longer a we people. Back in the 1950s, you know, people really were very, very concerned about the common good and the responsibilities that, you know, that would lead people to the common good. And so today, people don't focus nearly as much on the common good as they do on their individual rights. And individual rights can be overrun very quickly, and that leads to hostility. Hang on to that question a little bit, because I think we're going to get into that a little bit more as we go. So let me jump back into the PowerPoint, and we'll try to take another step here. where is, oh, here we are. All right, and we've been talking here about how we've been finding, looking for the answers and so forth. But the critical issue for me is that this is not simply about finding the new thing that we should do, but rather that we have to change our mindsets. Al Bott wrote this remarkably brief little book, The Triple Soy Decaf Latte Era. And he was able, in a very condensed form, to kind of put his finger on critical things. But one of the things he says there is that for the past 2 decades, organizations have been grasping for ways to deal with the alarming rate of change they are experiencing, both internally and in the marketplace. We have developed countless methods for managing change, and despite a completely abysmal record of results, we continue to see that the issue is not one of method, but of mindset. Now, just pause for a moment on that. Al Bott does not write or do his work from a religious or a congregational perspective. When he says for 20 years, organizations have been grasping for ways, he's not talking about the church. He's talking about corporate organizations. He's talking about businesses. He's talking about the military. One of the things that we have to get clear about is that this confusion, this chaos that as a church we are living into is not just ours. This is what all established organizations are living into at this point. And that what he's essentially saying here is that the way to work our way through this is not to continue to pursue what the next answer is, but we actually have to change our mindset. We have to change the way that we think about this. We have to change what we understand. And that has been pretty much the fundamental base of what I was trying to work on with the Quietly Courageous. And so, we point out a couple of things. I've and some of you have heard me do this before, to make the distinction between management and leadership, because both of them are needed in every organization, but they in fact are not the same. They answer different questions. Management answers the question, are we doing things right? And that assumes that we all agree on the right thing to do. Management was the fundamental way in which clergy and lay leaders functioned in their churches in the 1950s, because everybody knew what the right thing to do was. They already knew that they were going to have a candlelight service at 6 o'clock, or even at 11 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve, and that they needed a certain number of candles. And so, are we doing things right? Do we have the candles set up? Did somebody set the extra chairs up? Is everything in place for what we know we are going to do? And so leadership, which was in fact management back in the 1950s and 1960s, may have been keeping people busy, but it was actually fairly easy work to do. Leadership is considerably different. Leadership is not asking, are we doing things right? It's asking, are we doing right things? Is what we are about the right thing for us to be doing? And that will force us back into some really fundamental questions that I'll talk about in a minute. But management makes things go smoothly in an organization, and leadership disrupts the organization because it makes the organization go back and answer questions that it thought it already understood. And so that's when I was going to get into my conversation about how congregations are tradition-based voluntary associations. And they are hard to change because they operate on a management level. They assume that they're going to do next year what they did last year. And they assume that if they can get somebody to take an office and do something, that's sufficient, and that person will continue to do it until, maybe about 10 years after they died. Because in some sense, once you get your base established, you just assume it's going to continue to go. In a liquid culture, you can't do that. management questions get greatly reduced. This is really a leadership, not a management moment. You have to go back and ask the fundamental questions. And in work that I was doing in the 1980s, I had a colleague, Alice Mann, at the Alban Institute, and we were doing strategic planning. And we were forever running into congregations that had strategic plans, but never actually implemented them. Or we were running into congregations that were happy to talk about, how they were going to keep doing what they did, but they never really seemed to get around to it. We realized that all the planning was being interrupted, or it was not functional, because some fundamental questions were not being asked, and people were not facing into the changes that were already happening to them and around them. And we realized that there are three basic questions that all congregations have to ask in order to thrive in a changing environment. One is the question of identity. Who are we now? And quite frankly, most congregations don't know who they are now. They are much clearer about knowing who they were at one time. The kind of standard joke that I do is, ask people how many folk think of themselves as younger than they actually are. And, after everybody's done raising their hands, because that's how most of us think about ourselves, I point out what that means is that most of us know more about who we were at an earlier age than we actually are aware of who we are in this given moment. And sometimes we're caught up by surprise by something that happens to us, by something that, something physical that we can't do that we used to do, or something that we have forgotten how to do, or all of those things that remind us that we have changed. The task for a congregation is to figure out who they are now at this moment. And one of the things I would point out is that if you have any folk who have joined you in the past 6 months to a year, those new folk coming into your congregation probably know more about who you are now than you yourself as a leader may know, because of our temptation to always think of ourselves in the past tense. And then what has God called us to do now? In a changed circumstance, how do you continue a purpose if your situation has changed? I had a conversation with the general secretary of the Pub House, and one of the things that he was saying is that in publishing, one of the most difficult things that they're facing into right now is that the biggest hit that they have is that people have stopped buying Sunday school literature. Well, that's because Sunday school doesn't operate in the same form in a Zoom world or in a digital world. So people aren't buying those resources. Well, the question isn't how do you continue to buy the Sunday school material? The question is, our purpose now is to find ways to form our children in faith without a Sunday school. The purpose continues, but it is changed. The purpose is not how do you run a Sunday school. The purpose is how do you do faith formation with children when the Sunday school can't function as it used to. So you got to be clear about what the purpose, and then what is our context? Who's our neighbor now? And that's one of the big pieces that we're about to walk into right now. One of the things that Alice and I learned was that these are the three fundamental questions in times of change that all of us need to answer. And to a certain extent, let me say that we even need to answer these in our personal lives as well as in our congregational lives. But, even though all three have to be answered at some point, you can start with any question that is driving you the hardest. And the argument I'm making here is that the question that's driving us the hardest is the context question. Who is our neighbor now? Context of our ministry has shifted. Chapter 2 in the book, The Change That Demands Quiet Courage, for my money, and I know Methodists would never put money on anything, but for my money, chapter 2 is the most important chapter in the book, the cultural value shift. In my lifetime, I was born 1947. in my lifetime, we have gone through a cultural value shift, which has changed our social contract. The 1960s, the mid 1960s, was in fact the turning point for, the biggest turning point in this shift in the culture. There was a lot happening leading up to it. There's been a lot happening after that. But what I argue in that chapter is that we have shifted from a convergent culture to a divergent culture. To a culture, a convergent culture is one in which everybody has the same question, but they also have the same answer. It's a culture that pays attention to the similarities and to the agreement. They think in terms of we. The way I often explain that to a group is that, if we're all on this Zoom, well, let me say it another way. If we were not on the Zoom, if we were all in the same room having this conversation, and I asked the question of how far is it to the Philadelphia airport, the fact that we would all be sitting in the same room means that we have the same question and we have the same answer. How far is it to the Philadelphia airport is a convergent question. It's the same question that has the same answer. And that was the culture that pretty much was operating when the United Methodist denomination was at its greatest strength in the 1950s and into the early 1960s. How do you worship? Well, the liturgy was, how do you worship? That was the same question for everybody. And the answer was pretty much the same thing for everybody. It was in the front of the hymnal, the basic format for worship. You could tell what time it was in worship without looking at your watch, just by where you were in the liturgy. Everybody agreed that that's the way it was. Well, since then, because of the shifts of both cultural values and attitudes and technology with advertising and social media, we have shifted from a convergent culture to a divergent culture. And a divergent culture is one in which everybody may have the same question, but they have their own individual answers. And so in a divergent culture, if we're all sitting in the same room and I ask the question, not how far is it to the Philadelphia airport, but why do you want to go to the Philadelphia airport? The question would be the same for everybody. Why do you want to go to the Philadelphia airport? But the answers would be all over the place, all over the map, including the people who don't even want to go there. In a divergent question, if you ask the question, how should we worship? The answers come out in multiples in terms of what music we should use, how should we dress, when should we do it, what are the, what kind of atmosphere should we have? We have shifted dramatically from paying attention to our similarities and paying attention deeply to our differences. Now think about what's happening not only in your congregation, but to our denomination. There was a time that our general conference would get together and people would begin to work toward the mean of their similarities. They would leave whatever their differences were behind and move toward what they agreed on. What we've been watching in our general conference and in so many other organizations in the divergent culture is that people begin from some place where they share some similarities, but immediately begin to break out into their different subgroups about either what they believe to be different from other people or what their preferences are. And so when we gather together, we are not a people who are looking for ways to come together. We're looking for ways to distinguish ourselves from one another to figure out who's right. We have shifted from a we culture to an I culture. And the biggest part I want to kind of get to here is the social contract, and then we'll come back to see if there's any questions that you want to jump into at this point. But the social contract is an agreement that we make with one another about how we will live together. And people in a nation always do that. They always have an underlying social contract about what's appropriate to do as we live together. one of the things that that has been pointed out is that at every stage, the Israelites in the Old Testament, when they went through dramatic times like the Exodus or the exile, whenever they were challenged, they always had to answer two questions. Again, the one question is, how will we now be with God? And the other question is, how will we now be with one another? And so when you read the story of the Exodus and of the 10 Commandments and of learning how to organize themselves and who was going to lead, that was all about people learning how to live with one another at a given time in a particular situation. All cultures do that. Well, the point I'm after here is that in a convergent culture, we lived under what Daniel Yankelovich identified as a giving-getting compact. It was a relational contract. In order for me to get what I want from others, I have to first give what is required of me. If I want a good retirement that can sustain me in my older years, I first have to give years of faithful work. If I want a good marriage that will kind of nurture me in my continued life, I have to be willing to give to my spouse and to my children. So it's a relational contract of, if I'm going to get something, I have to first give something. If I want to live in a peaceful nation, I have to contribute, I have to give to a common good. Now, in this cultural value shift that we've been through, we have moved from the convergent culture to the divergent culture, in which the social contract has changed. And the social contract that we're now under is best described by Hugh Heclo in his work on institutions. And he says we're now following a moral pole star. And the moral pole star says that I am free to do and to have whatever I want, up to the point that I interfere with other people being able to do and have whatever they want. Now, two things about that. Do you hear that our social compact, the contract, has changed from a relational contract about my giving in order to get, which requires a relationship with other people, to a moral pole star, which is all about me. I can have or do whatever I want as long as I don't interfere with other people doing whatever they have or whatever they want. It's all about the individual, not about the relationship. The old contract was transactional. The new social contract we live in is so much more boundary keeping. You can't come across my boundary and I can't go across your boundary. This relates to the question that we were just looking at a little bit earlier. Why is there so much anger? Because people feel that their boundaries have been crossed. People, if you're in a convergent culture and you are advised to wear a mask for health benefits, you wear a mask because what you're feeling is your responsibility to the common good. I will wear a mask in a pandemic so that I don't give the virus to others, and so they won't give it to me. But if you're in a divergent culture and someone tells you to wear a mask, you begin to question, why should someone tell me how I have to wear a mask? They have crossed my boundary of what I choose to do. It's no longer an issue of freedom. It's no longer an issue of responsibility. It suddenly has become an issue of freedom. All right, we're going to go for questions in a minute, but don't miss the fact that our tradition-based voluntary associations are still operating out of a convergent culture that we have learned, and that the better part of our theology, even though it will have expressions of the I that we're not going to get into today, but even though our Christian theology has expressions of the I, is heavily slanted toward the we. The least, the last, and the lost always comes to our mind, which is always an issue of common good, always an issue of we, always an issue of community. Paul, when he wrote, was writing about a messianic community, not a personal salvation. So we're in this mix in a real clear way. Okay, so let's get back. Is there a question or two here that you want to play with?
Yes, two related questions. From Laurel Tombs, we have the cultural shift. Is this another reason that we have become less relevant? I preach from a we perspective all the time and believe that this is faithful. But even those who regularly in our pews, does this fall on deaf ears? Do they struggle to take teaching further outside or be able to share or relate to others? And the second question from Alicia Giuliani is, even that new contract is being broken, there's no point where, quote, the others, end quote, come first.
Well, okay, let me just jump into a piece or two. I'm going to encourage you not to think of yourself as irrelevant. I'm going to begin to encourage you to think as more of yourself as more important than ever. Because the church holds a voice that the culture needs and wants. It just doesn't happen to be asking for it at the moment. But that's not different from a lot of other institutions. We are in a moment in which, okay, back up real quickly. Institutions are terribly important. Institutions are the way in which we order our lives, both individually and in community. We need institutions to know how to be with each other, to form our lives, to be supported in our lives. So we need them, but we don't trust them. The big issue today is that as much as we need institutions, we deeply do not trust them. And we don't trust them for two reasons. Now, this really is the work of Hugh Hecklow, who was taking a look at the role of institutions in our culture. One of the reasons that we don't trust our institutions is because they have earned our mistrust. Think about how often you cannot trust a politician to say what is actually on his or her mind or what's going to happen. Think about in politics how many times you have watched people subvert their own vows, and we're struggling with that even at the moment. Think about the times when people in any of our institutions, think about our banking institution, how Wells Fargo is a prime example about how they, kind of talked so many people into getting accounts, not because it was good for the people, but because it was good for the business of the bank. Think about how much money has been stolen. Think about the clergy in the Roman Catholic Church who cannot be trusted with children. In other words, there's no place that you can go in an institution and not point to people that have served themselves over the purpose of the institution, or point to places where the institution has served itself instead of its constituency. My dad was a banker. The bank is an institution. One of the things that we would talk about 10 years after he retired is that he was glad that he got out of banking while it was still a service institution instead of a sales institution. Because one of the transitions that has happened is that banks used to serve people through relationships to help people get done what they want to do with their lives. My dad was in banking when it was all about building relationships with people to help them do what they wanted to do. And at the moment, banks primarily are into selling you their services so that they can strengthen their own institution. We don't trust institutions because they have earned our mistrust. And the church has done that. Okay. But then Hecklow points out the second reason we don't trust institutions. And that is because they carry the disciplines that infringe on the freedom that we want as individuals. In other words, if I want financial security for my retirement, or if I want a college education for my kids, I might go to my bank and I'll say, this is what I need. And the very first thing the bank is going to say to me is that, okay, if you want that, here are the disciplines you're going to have to follow. You're going to have to go on a budget. You're going to have to save money. You're going to have to invest. You're going to have to, pay attention to how long you keep your car. Okay, it's going to introduce me to a whole set of financial disciplines that suddenly go against my moral pole star that say, well, wait a minute, this feels uncomfortable. How come, if I want these things, how come I have to change everything that I'm doing to be responsible? If you want, continued health, you're going to go to the YMCA or to some gym or something, and the first thing they're going to do is introduce you to disciplines. Not so happy about that anymore in a moral pole star. You want to find meaning in your life and have a relationship with Jesus Christ, you're going to go to the church. And the first thing they're going to do is introduce you to discipleship. There are some things I have to do here in order to get. Do you hear that by their very nature, institutions stand against the freedom that people think is their right? Now, we're talking about this in a very general way. But that does not mean that the institution is irrelevant by any means. Do you really hope to be able to have resources for retirement or for education or for anything else if you do not follow the disciplines that you can find in that institution? Do you really think that you can find meaning and a relationship with Jesus Christ if you do not follow some disciplines, some structured way of building that into your life? This whole issue is here. Do you think you can live a happy life if you are not in community with others? In other words, what the church holds is as important and as necessary as ever, but it's holding it in a culture at the moment that cannot easily hear it. And changing the music we sing is not going to make a huge difference to the people who are asking questions about meaning, or getting our clergy to stop wearing, stoles and start wearing polo shirts is not going to make a huge difference. But being able to understand what truth we do hold and know that we're going to have to find a different way to express it in a changed culture is in fact how we're going to be able to move ahead. All right, let me see if I can jump ahead. As usual, I'm running out of time. This is a story of my life. Make one or two more points and then we'll see if we can get back to it. But, we're talking about this great cultural shift. One of the things is that we have to really go back to think about our leadership. Quietly Courageous is trying to focus in on leadership, on the so what question. If this is really, the kind of change that we are now living in, what does that mean for us who are leaders, clergy and lay? And so I started this distinction between management and leadership and just walk into that a little bit more. That management is all about technical work. This comes from the work and the research that Ron Heifetz did out of Harvard School of Business. Technical work is the application of known solutions to known problems. That's what we had in the 1950s. Technical work is knowing whether or not you have enough candles for the candlelight Christmas Eve service. It's a known solution to a known problem. Adaptive work is the work that you have to do when you're not facing a problem, but you're facing a changed condition. And this culture is a very changed condition that we are now living in. Adaptive work means you have to learn how to do things in a new way. And that's what leadership is all about. Are we doing right things? Not are we doing things right? And so leaders have to learn how to shift from starting from the point of doing things, and they have to know how to figure out what is it they have to learn in order to move ahead. Another way of saying that is that management is all about providing answers. People go to the pastor or they go to the governing board or they go to a committee chair and they say, tell me what I should do. And leaders in a management situation say, well, do this, This is what you do. This is your answer. In leadership, what is really required is not leaders searching for answers that don't exist, but rather coming up with better questions. And that goes to the heart of that little example about Sunday school literature. When you're on Zoom and you can't have a Sunday school class and you can't get these together, and people are going to say, pastor, or they're going to say to the chairperson of the Sunday school, how are we going to have Sunday school? Well, there's no real clear answer to that. What we need is a better question. And the better question is, how will we now do faith formation with children when we can't get them in Sunday school? And so leaders now have to kind of be willing to walk into better questions. So let's kind of stop there. And if there's any other questions, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes to kind of wrap up. And then anything else you want to pursue? I know this is all kind of quick and we're just hitting some spots here.
We have 2 related questions. The first from Lloyd Spear. How do you see the biblical call to servanthood in the midst of the shift? And from Richard Reimert, please ask, Christianity calls us to die to ourselves. How does that work in this situation?
Dying to ourselves, that was the easier one for me. One of the things that's happened to me, that's happened to you, that's happened to all of us, is that we have constructed a self that lived in an earlier time, pre-pandemic, pre-globalization. You can go to all the pre's, they'll go to, if we're in a postmodern time, we constructed an identity, a personhood that lived well in a modern era. In all of this, we have to die to ourselves in order to learn how to live in the new one. If you want a little bit of a closer example, I've spent about 40 years traveling, in which that meant that I was away from my home sanctuary. As a matter of fact, we got to the point that when I came home, I went to my wife's church because I was never really a part of it anymore. I was away from it for too long. And so I used to carry with me my spiritual anchors as I went. And one of the anchors that I carried with me was, Pandora Radio, where I can get on and I can listen to a channel that was at that time called Traditional Country Hymns. And for a whole time, wherever I was, if I couldn't get to church, I could listen to my hymns. And they were going to play the hymns that I knew. And they were going to be done by country and Western folk, but man, I knew those hymns and I could sing along. And then I began to learn that if I'm going to move ahead in this culture, I was going to have to not give that up, but I was going to have to die to myself to say that's the only way that hymnody can express the truth of the gospel. There are other ways, other forms that people, and I had to get into that. I had to open myself up to it. Even if I were to choose one that I had formed myself in, I had to die to that to allow something else to be reborn. Now that's kind of a very small example, but this issue of dying to ourselves, we quite often have to die to our preferences in order to follow the gospel purpose.
Gil, I was specifically asking, how do we deal with the tension between the call of the gospel, at least as we've traditionally presented it, of Christ to die to self, as opposed to this call, this moving into a more individualistic society?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, we're not going to go too far of this because of the time that we have. Was that Lloyd? Anyway, yeah. Let me just jump into that. I don't want us to get into the position as if I and we are right and wrong. There's not a right way to this life and a wrong way to live this life. I and we are in tension with each other. A lawyer went to Jesus and said, Jesus, what is the most important commandment of all? And Jesus said, there are in fact 2 of the greatest commandments. The one is to love your God with all your heart, and the other is to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, these aren't just two more commandments for you to pay attention to. This is baseline stuff. Your relationship with God, which is an I relationship. Discipleship is all about forming ourselves as an individual. There is great legitimacy in an I culture of people who are clearly aware of themselves, understanding themselves, becoming fully authentic in themselves, and having a relationship as an individual, both with God and with others as an individual. But when we move over and we talk about loving your neighbor, now we're talking about the we. Okay? And so the issue is, when we are talking about the we are no longer forming ourselves just around our own needs. We are talking about the common good. What is it that belongs to all, that we all need to be able to share? All right. The deal is that in that kind of a polarity in which I and we both have their legitimate parts of our lives and of creation, we have to find the right balance. And whenever we swing too far to one side, we have to rebalance. We have to push back toward the other. Right now, our culture has pushed too far to one side, to the I side. And so we see an attack on our capital by people who say that, you know, the election didn't go the way that I wanted it to go. Therefore, I have the right to overthrow that election. That's an I statement. Now, I've overstated that. I get you may, wherever you are politically, but that's an I idea. And so we push back. No, that's not how we have a social contract together. The social contract has to belong to all people. But friends, there was also a time in which we pushed very, very far to the extreme of the we. And that there wasn't room for people to have individuality. We talked about, the constraints that we were under. As a matter of fact, back in the 50s and the 60s, these were the constraints that everybody was pushing against, trying to find their individual lives, because they had been constrained into, there was only one role women could have at that time, and it was as a wife or a house, I was going to say a housekeeper, but you all get where I'm going. And women were pushing out of that, and so what I'm saying is that we are in this. One of the things about that is, in a we culture, the church has to learn how to push back and balance toward the I and say people have a responsibility to find their authentic selves in God. In an I culture, they have to push back and say, we have to learn how to love our neighbor and begin to figure out who that neighbor is again. One of the things about racism, friends, is that we have denied neighborliness to Black and brown people for so long. It is time for us to push back. We can't do that anymore. And so this pushing back and forth. And so what I don't want to do is invite us to get to a position to say that theologically the church is in one place which is right and the culture is someplace which is wrong. No. Our gospel covers it all. But it sure does help to know what time it is and which way we ought to be facing. And please don't set the church against the culture. Because if you think we don't reflect the culture, and if you don't think this we stuff and this convergent, divergent stuff isn't inside our congregation, inside our denomination, boy, am I setting you up for a happy day, huh? Well,
and you set us up well for next week.
There you go.
We've crossed the noon mark. So as being consistent with the disciples of Jesus Christ in the Wesleyan tradition, we want to be faithful to our time stewardship. So I want to thank you for your presentation. I want to thank everyone for coming on. Please put your questions in the chat before we end the call, which will be very soon, momentarily. And we're going to create a discussion group online, which you'll all be invited to continue the conversation in between sessions. So I thank everybody and God bless you for coming today. Thank you very much.
And as we close out, if you were moved today, I encourage you to invite a member from your church who wasn't here. We have representatives from all across every district. So invite someone next week to hear this conversation so that they can also experience the transformation through this. God bless you, friends. Thank you, Gil. Have a blessed day today.
Bye all.